a pink sweater tumbled down the stone steps and landed in a puddle, its rabbit ear hood soaking up the cold as if it were drinking tears. A 7-year-old girl scooped it up with shaking hands, while her baby brother whimpered against her collarbone, both of them framed by the hard laughter of a woman in a red dress and the crystal clink of a raised wineglass. Somewhere beyond the gate, a black sedan idled, and a man inside tightened his grip on the steering wheel as if holding back the past itself. Before we begin, if this kind of story speaks to your heart, share where you're watching from. It's always beautiful to see how far a story like this can travel. Enjoy the story. Chapter 1. The stone steps. The Carter estate in Scarsdale wore the morning like a mask. Sunlight laid clean and soft over hedges clipped into obedient shapes. The white stones of the entryway warmed just enough to pretend at welcome. But the air still remembered yesterday's lilies, the funeral wreaths, and the way grief had hung in the foyer like a fog that couldn't find the door. Emily Carter didn't have words for any of that. She had Michael's weight on her hip, and a suitcase too heavy to drag far, and the sound of glass breaking behind her when the stepmother laughed too sharply at something the man beside her said. The stuffed bear Erlington, named for the time he lost one ear on a moving train, lay face down, but an eye watching everything sideways. "Get out," Vanessa Blake said, tasting the consonants like they were a cherry gloss on her lower lip. "Trash leaves by the servants' gate. I won't have you growing roots in my foyer." Behind her, Richard Hale popped a cork and let the red wine splash like a blood-red bruise across a white napkin. "To freedom," he said, fake sorrow clouding eyes that were greed blue and mean. "Poor David. Poor David, but my God, the peace." Emily's knees hit the cold steps. Please, Michael is only one. I'll work, I promise, Don't," Vanessa cut in, her heel nicking the toppled suitcase so it coughed up socks and a photograph and a cheap necklace that had always been too big for Emily's throat. "Stop calling me that. I'm not your mother and I never will be." On any other morning, the black Mercedes would have slid past the gate and the man inside, gray suit, clean collar, life sorted into neat lines, would have waited for the intercom to answer. But he heard the bear hit stone. He heard a girl try to keep her voice from breaking and fail. He heard the laugh. Jonathan Reed opened his door so sharply the sound sliced into the courtyard, and every face turned. He crossed the lawn in 4 long strides. For a second, all the years between now and his own doorsteps, the orphanage with the iron bed and the thin blanket and a colder word than welcome, dropped away. Then he knelt and picked up the pink sweater. "Hold him tight," he said quietly to the girl, whose tear-blurred eyes were trying so hard not to blink. He shook the sweater free of grit, folded it clean, and set it atop the suitcase's chaos like a small promise. "What's your name?" "Emily," she whispered. "Emily Carter, this is Michael." "Jonathan Reed," he said, standing and turning to face the red dress and the smirk. "I knew your father. David Carter was a good man." Richard lifted his glass again in a lazy salute. "Family matters, friend. Outsiders don't get a vote." "Wrong," Jonathan said, voice steadying into that firm, measured place he used in court when truth had to be hammered into shape. "You are endangering children with witnesses and cameras. If you don't stop, I call Child Protective Services and the police. Right now." A head popped above the clipped hedge. The neighbor, a woman with tired knuckles and a phone already recording, called across, Linda Green. "I saw you throw those babies out. I'll testify." From the guardhouse, a tall man jogged up, uniform brisk, kindness visible in the lines around his eyes. "Howard Bennett," he said, frowning at the clothes strewn across the stones. "The gate cameras rolling. What's happening here?" What was happening was Vanessa's smile cracking at the edges, the faintest flicker toward the camera over the door, as if remembering the precise angle of its blind spot. What was happening was Emily's hand, finding Jonathan's jacket sleeve and clinging. What was happening was a sliver of sunlight finding the bear's button eye and making it gleam like a witness. Jonathan lifted Michael into his arms, pressed the boy's warm head beneath his chin. "We're leaving," he said. "Now." Vanessa slid down the steps fast enough for her perfume to bolt ahead of her. "Are you abducting someone else's children in broad daylight?" I am removing them from danger, he answered. On record. Howard, Linda called to the guard without looking away from her phone. There's a side gate through the parking lot if they need it. I'll walk them out. Howard took a half step to block Richard when the man moved in a way that wasn't exactly a lunge, but had violence coiled under it. You try something, Howard said, pleasant still, and you'll spend the day explaining it to people with badges. Vanessa's voice went sugar-sweet and poison-dark. You will regret this, Jonathan Reed. He didn't look back. He buckled Michael into the car seat, tugged the strap with the practice of someone who had learned quickly what mattered, then tucked the blanket around Emily's knees and set the bear in her lap. From now on, he said, hand over her small fist as if pressing his palm against a promise, you're not alone. He drove away with the lanes blurring into ribbons of light and shadow, the weight of a 7-year-old's trust like a breath he had to take, deliberately, again and again. Chapter 2. What a letter can carry he addressed to say thank you, light gray Armani. Cufflinks his assistant chose when he forgot that not all gratitude was spoken in a suit. Jonathan had planned to stop at the florist for a simple arrangement, lilies or maybe the sort of sunflowers that looked like they were teaching themselves how to hold up their own heads. He had rehearsed a sentence, my name is Jonathan Reed. When I was a child, a stranger paid the debts that should have broken me. I think your family saved my life. Maria Santos had done her homework the way she did everything, sharp, efficient, with a stubbornness learned in the parts of the city where sirens sounded like weather. The donor you've been searching for, she had said over the phone 2 days ago, is David Carter. Jonathan had put the car in park just long enough to feel the way the name fit into the space he had left empty in his chest. He tried to say thank you to the air of his car and found nothing in his throat. Now, driving south, he glanced in the rearview and saw Emily watching, unfocused and tired, but vigilant. Michael slept. That was Grace. His apartment, glass and soft, gray and quiet, had never fit like a home. He set Michael on the sofa and tucked the blanket beneath the boy's toes the way he had watched nurses do in the ERs where he had waited for verdict nights to end. He warmed milk and set it in front of Emily, whose fingers looked too small around the rim. My dad used to say, she murmured, not looking up, when something bad happens, find a good person, but are there still good people? The question slid a blade under a seam he kept stitched shut. He remembered a boy huddled on a thin mattress, counting the cracks in the ceiling because numbers were the only thing that didn't leave. There are, he said, settling beside her, and tonight one of them is staying. His phone lit. Maria. The caller ID didn't require a decision, only movement. He answered, his voice quiet so the sleeping boy wouldn't dream of thunder, and listened to the detective say, I got into the car's dashcam. There's something you should see. He should have said no. Not tonight. He should have stayed in the warm circle of a sofa and 2 small breaths and a television turned low. But the next hour would be the hinge the whole house turned on. At the cafe near Union Square, Maria had her hair tied back and a stack of files brief enough to make a prosecutor sweat. She slid the laptop so they could both see. David Carter's face filled the screen unshaven, eyes lined with the kind of exhaustion that comes from wrestling something you can't name. If you're seeing this, David said, voice rough, then something went wrong. If I'm gone, protect Emily and Michael. Vanessa and Richard cannot be trusted. They want the company, the money. The children are what matters. The screen went black like a curtain falling. In the dark reflection, Jonathan saw his own mouth shape, thank you, without sound. He had brought a letter with him tonight, creased, barely legible in places, the one he kept folded in the inside pocket of every jacket he owned. It had been written on cheap paper from the orphanage office. It had been signed by a stranger. It had one sentence he had memorized, Kid, I don't know you, but I know what it feels like to sit where you sit. Somebody carried me once. Let me carry you this time. Maria's voice pulled him back. There's more. The garage camera picked up audio. It's rough, but listen. She hit play. Richard's voice slurred with excitement or fear, not alcohol for once. I messed with the car's board. He'll never, idiot, Vanessa hissed in reply. Keep your mouth shut. It wasn't enough to arrest anyone. Maria's mouth had already twisted at the chain of custody challenges. but it was enough to make breathing feel like swallowing glass. "They'll go public," Maria warned. "They'll paint you the villain." "They won't be wrong," Jonathan said, still staring at the blank screen that had become a mirror. "A stranger just walked into their life and took the children away." He stood. "We need witnesses. We need the neighbor. We need the guard. We need to buy Emily and Michael a few nights where no one can hurt them." On his way back to the apartment, the lights of Manhattan smeared across glass, beautiful and cold. In the rearview, Emily's eyes had the look of someone who had learned the sound a door makes when it opens and means harm. Back on the sofa, he watched her watch a muted news broadcast. Vanessa's face filled the screen, mascara smudged artistically. She tugged tissues from a silver box, looked down, looked up. "My husband just died," she said, breaking perfectly on cue, "and a stranger kidnapped my children." Kidnapped? The word rolled like a grenade through the apartment. Emily flinched as if it had exploded near her ear. "They're lying," Jonathan said calmly, reaching for the remote. "We will prove it." In the black that followed, his window reflected the three of them. The man, the girl holding the baby, the bear on the salt-colored rug. And for a second, he let himself imagine a future in that picture. He hadn't known he was allowed to. His phone buzzed again. "Maria." "There's a trust," she said. "Hidden at the bank. It names the children. It mentions a letter of wishes. And Jonathan, there's a name in the letter." The line went quiet. "Whose name?" he asked, though a strange, impossible answer had already found his pulse. "Yours." Chapter 3, face to face with the future Vanessa wanted a meeting. The request came through an assistant of an assistant, a man with a voice like expensive whiskey and contempt. "A closed conference room, Midtown, 8 a.m., he said, like time itself should be grateful. "You're not going," Maria warned Jonathan as soon as he told her. "This is a setup or a trap or both." "Probably," he said, "but I've seen what happens when the truth gets left in a hallway. If she doesn't get to say her piece in a room with a table between us, she'll say it on camera for ratings." He didn't tell Maria that he'd found Emily in the hall when he came back last night, knees tucked to her chest, listening hard for the sound of the elevator that would mean he had kept his promise. He didn't tell her that he had sat on the floor across from Emily and let their breathing synchronize in the quiet until she fell asleep. He told the building's security to stand close at 8 a.m. He told the front desk to let no one but this one assistant pass. He crossed the marble lobby and rode an elevator that reflected him back from 4 angles. The suit, the eyes drawn tight, the man who hadn't realized how painful it would be to want something like a family. What he didn't know was that Emily slipped into the elevator behind a line of paralegals carrying 2 large coffees. She sat outside the conference room with Michael's bear squished to her chest and listened to the muffled voices through the seam of the door. Vanessa started the way she always did, with beauty and threat, and a perfumed kind of cruelty. "You're so naive," she said softly. "Those children are keys, Jonathan. You have put your own hand into the lock. And now you want what? To be a hero? Heroes don't have the stomach for real life." Richard, spinning a glass of water by the stem, added, "We already took care of the sheriff." "People like you always forget the county level, all that small town power. The story will be what we say it is." "Funny," Jonathan replied. "I always assumed you were merely careless with money and careless with other people's lives, but you're careful with details. Which is why you should know this. Your neighbor is willing to testify. Your guard filed an incident report that mentions you telling the children to disappear. The cameras, well, your house is a lover of angles. That neighbor woman," Vanessa waved a hand, "she has past due taxes. She's 1 bad week from silence, and the guard, he's fireable." "You will find," Jonathan said, the calm so steady it frightened even him, "that I am very inconvenient to fire and very careful with witnesses." Outside the door, Emily's fingers dug into the bear's plush. She made herself breathe slowly. Don't be afraid of the truth, she would later tell herself. Be afraid of forgetting how to speak it. When Jonathan left the meeting, he found her sitting on the bench, feet not touching the floor. She looked up as if she were surprised the door would open and bring the person she had hoped for. "You came back," she said simply. He crouched so their eyes matched. "I told you I would." "Why do grown-ups lie?" she asked, studying his face as if she could find a promise hiding under the skin. "Because they're scared," he said. "But you aren't. That's what will make them lose." She slipped her hand into his without hesitation, and they walked out into the morning where a dozen people at the traffic light had already seen the news and were too polite to stare as long as they wanted to. Chapter 4. The center where people remember your name. The sign said Roxbury Community Center in hand-painted letters that had resisted the weather for 3 summers in a row. Inside, crayons lived in old coffee cans, and the whiteboard wore a permanent faint shadow of words that had refused to be erased entirely. "Please share, be gentle, take turns." "Why are we here?" Emily asked, her voice caught between fear and curiosity. "Because this place saved me once," Jonathan said. "And because sometimes it's easier to remember you're a child if everyone around you refuses to forget it." He knew the air so well he could have walked it with his eyes closed. The smell of institutional cleaner and sugar cookies, the way the hall hummed with a particular pitch of children's laughter that told you everyone had eaten breakfast. He knew which corner had the crate of board books, and which window stick sun decals had been there 15 years ago and had somehow survived everyone's small fingers. "Jonathan," someone called, and the name reached him softened. Miss Rosa walked toward them, silver hair pinned in a practical knot, glasses perched at the end of her nose, eyebrows made to deliver joy as often as judgment. She cupped Michael's cheeks the way grandmothers did everywhere. "Look at you. Do you remember the winter you showed up with shoes 3 sizes too small because you didn't know how to ask for a different pair?" He smiled. "I remember the lesson." She turned to Emily. "We keep the crayons over there," she said, pointing. "Lots of green today. Someone decided we live in the forest." Emily hesitated, then drifted toward the table where 2 boys were coloring a house with smoke curling from the chimney. One looked up and slid a handful of crayons across so the box end faced her like an invitation to begin. Emily made a line, then another. She pressed the purple into the paper until the wax left richness where there had been empty white. Michael babbled and all at once made a sound that was unmistakable. "Da." Jonathan froze. The syllable hit him precisely where self-control couldn't protect him. He tried to make his face work as if this didn't change anything and found that it changed everything. Emily glanced up when she heard it, saw the man in the gray suit go very still, and then watched something in his shoulders loosen, not in defeat, but in relief. "Your father," she asked later in a quiet corner where the noise of the room made the world feel safer, "would he have brought us here?" "He brought me to a place very much like this," Jonathan said. "He just didn't tell me it was him." She frowned, puzzled. He told her about the letter, about a donation to an orphanage and a handwritten note with a signature that had been only an initial until Maria found the rest of the name. About a stranger placing a palm against a scale and saving a boy without asking for thanks. He didn't tell her yet that Maria had called again, voice serious. "The trust document is real," she said. "It moves control of the company to a board if David dies and leaves all personal assets in a grantor trust for the kids. Vanessa isn't even mentioned. There's a separate letter of wishes. It mentions you by name, Jonathan. If you find the boy with the threadbare sweater, it says, 'Tell him I always meant to tell him my name.'" He let that sit alone with him for a few hours. Heaven had never seemed geographically plausible to him, but if there was a place beyond this one, where truth made fewer compromises, he wanted David to be able to see what happened next. The reporters invaded the center just after 2. They came all at once like a weather system, cameras like additional eyes, microphones thrust forward like accusations that had been practicing their angles in the mirror. "Mr. Reed, are you exploiting these children? Emily, do you want to go back to your stepmother? Why did you remove them without consent?" Emily flinched. Michael startled, and then screamed like only a baby who doesn't understand a room full of strangers can scream. Jonathan stood in front of them and did his job. The words he had used to defend complicated corporations and even more complicated people found their purpose. "We won't be talking today," he said, voice even. "But there is a hearing scheduled, evidence will be presented, and the truth is patient." A hand, Miss Rosa's, settled on Emily's shoulder from behind, warm and steady. The girl drew breath. And for a second, the room belonged to the people in it, not the cameras watching it. Chapter 5. The weight of a gavel. The words emergency hearing have a way of emptying a man's lungs. The Manhattan courthouse at 9 a.m. was a predictable machine with its own heartbeat. The bass thump of the revolving door, the hush as people passed security, the way every conversation seemed to get filed as evidence even if it wasn't in the right room. Reporters waited on the steps, all elbows and equipment. "Mr. Reed, one question," he kept walking, Michael tucked against him, Emily a half step to his right, Linda Green 3 steps behind, and Howard Bennett flanking them on the left like a guardian no one had asked for but everyone was grateful to have. Maria joined them in the hallway, sliding Jonathan a small USB drive the way a priest might press a rosary into a believer's hand. Inside the courtroom, Vanessa wore grief like a costume tailored overnight. Black shawl, pale face, lips trembled on cue. Richard had learned how to perform sorrow from television shows where everyone cried at exactly the half-hour mark. Their lawyer, Charles Whitman, the kind of man who could make the alphabet sound like an attack, stood and began with words filed sharp. "Your Honor, this is a case of an outsider with resources exploiting a vulnerable family. He removed the children without consent. He has no standing. He has." Judge Patricia Coleman, gray streaks shining in her hair like a blade, lifted one hand. The room calmed itself out of respect she had earned one careful case at a time. "We will examine consent. We will examine standing. We will examine the meaning of the word family." "Proceed." Whitman gestured at Vanessa as if unveiling a sculpture. "The children's stepmother wishes to speak." Vanessa stood. "I have been painted a monster," she said, eyes glistening. "But I have only love in my heart. I feared for the children when a stranger took them. I called the police. I wept all night." Emily raised her hand. The motion was absurd in a courtroom, perfectly appropriate in a second-grade class and still somehow right. The judge's mouth softened. "Yes, Miss Carter. Do I get to talk too?" Emily asked, voice small but steady. "You do," Judge Coleman said. "Take your time." Emily stepped forward, glanced at Jonathan, who nodded once. "If she loved us," Emily asked the room, "why did she throw us out of the house the same day my dad was buried?" The silence after that question felt like water freezing into a sheet. Whitman's pen hovered above his legal pad. Vanessa's breath went ragged. Richard watched the floor as if looking anywhere else would mean someone could read his face too easily. Maria stood. "Your Honor, I have dashcam footage from David Carter's car," she said, flicking a look at Whitman that dared him to argue chain of custody in front of a father's last words. "With the court's permission." The screen lit, and David Carter's voice filled the room. He didn't cry, he didn't perform. He simply told the truth the way men who have run out of time do. "If something happens to me," he said, "take care of my kids. Vanessa and Richard, I'm scared of what they want. I'm scared of what they're willing to do. The board knows where my will is. The bank has the trust instructions. The children first. Always." When the screen went dark, 2 things happened at once. Richard's control cracked and he spat, if he hadn't crashed, and then caught the sentence with a hand too slow. And Linda Green, voice shaking but not breaking, stood to say, "I saw the day they threw those kids out. I saw it. I'll say it again, under oath, here or anywhere." Howard followed, his uniform jacket too tight across the shoulders for anyone to miss how solid he was. "The camera on the gate shows them outside with their suitcase. You can pull the logs. I filed a report." Whitman pushed his chair back slow, the calculation happening in his eyes like the math of a losing game. He tried one more time. "Even if, hypothetically, there were concerns, Mr. Reed has no kinship tie." Maria lifted a second document. "Your Honor, the bank's letter, the trust, and a letter of wishes." She handed it to the clerk, who brought it to the judge. Judge Coleman read silently, brow lifting at one line. "If possible," the judge read aloud, "find the boy with the threadbare sweater I met years ago without telling him my name. He knows what it means to be alone. He will not leave my children if they need him." Vanessa's face emptied. She ran out of words. The gavel had never seemed fragile to Jonathan before. It had always been a tool, an instrument. Now, in Judge Coleman's hand, it felt like a weight the world had been waiting to balance. "In light of the evidence," she said, voice a measured bridge between anger and law. The court is inclined to terminate the guardianship petition of Mrs. Vanessa Blake, to appoint Mr. Jonathan Reed as temporary guardian pending completion of full proceedings, and to refer the allegations of attempted murder and fraud to the district attorney's office. She looked directly at Emily. Miss Carter, I am sorry for your loss. The court will do better by you than those who failed you. The gavel struck. Vanessa moved as if to lunge, a flash of red in a room lined with wood, but two officers laid careful hands on her arms. Richard sat back down slowly like a marionette whose strings had been cut unevenly. Emily turned and ran, not away but to. She collided with Jonathan and found his arms already open. Michael clapped at the sound the gavel had made. We have a home, don't we? Emily asked into his shoulder. Not just a home, he said. A family. Chapter 6. The bruise and the bloom. The victory didn't close every door. It opened a few others that required patience and more strength than courtrooms ask. The media still wanted a story. They wanted answers with outlines that could be understood in the time between commercials. Jonathan turned off the television when the segment began, the one with the voiceover that used the phrase manufactured family, as if love could be poured into a mold and sold by weight. We'll prove it, Emily said, surprising him. Her voice had found a new register, small still but anchored. Not to them, to ourselves. Miss Karen Monroe, Emily's teacher, knocked the next afternoon with books, and a worry she kept trying to hide. Linda Green brought cinnamon pastry, and a story from her own childhood that made Emily's eyes fill with a compassion too large for someone so small. Howard had flowers delivered with a note that said, simply, I hope your windows always open to more than they close. Maria's office grew busier. The DA filed charges. Whitman made statements in curt, careful sentences about vigorously defended, but the air had gone out of their case. The garage audio, the dashcam, the neighbor's video, the gate camera. Truth had made itself visible in more places than one. Jonathan's apartment changed shape. The glass walls seemed less like a display case and more like a greenhouse where fragile things could learn a little about light. He moved through it differently. He found he was buying bananas and little socks and a kind of cereal that promised to make you strong at breakfast. He found he was learning lullabies on YouTube at midnight, singing badly, laughing when he couldn't find the note. One night, he handed Emily a faded photograph, David Carter at a holiday party at the orphanage, eyes bright, surrounded by children who barely let him keep his arms to himself. In the corner, a thin boy stared too straight into the camera like he was bracing for the flash. Jonathan, your father saved me when I didn't know how to say I needed saving, Jonathan said. Everything I do now, yes, it's gratitude, but it's also because when I look at you and Michael, I don't see debt. I see a job I want to do. Emily traced the faces with a fingertip. I have two fathers, she read softly from her diary later that week when she felt brave enough. One gave me life, one taught me love. Jonathan pressed his palm over his eyes. He held still until he was certain his voice wouldn't ruin the moment. Chapter 7. A letter meant to be found. They moved out of the penthouse into a house with creaky stairs and a backyard the size of a small dream. Jonathan built a bookshelf that slanted until he learned how to measure right. Emily painted over two stains on the wall that looked like continents from a geography book. Michael discovered dirt and joy in the same afternoon and became a farmer who used a plastic spoon as a shovel. 1 year after the gavel, friends gathered in a small hall where fresh flowers crowded a makeshift stage, and the banner at the back said the David Carter Foundation in letters that mocked how heavy grief could be by being so light. The foundation had already paid the rent for 2 families in trouble, bought a row of beds for a group home where the mattresses had been older than the children, funded a scholarship for a kid who argued well enough to win lunch every day, and now had a chance to argue in a courtroom. Jonathan held Michael on his hip. Emily stood straight beside him with a candle she balanced like an oath. They lit 3 candles, one for David and all he had done without insisting anyone say it out loud, one for a mother whose name didn't get mentioned enough but who had loved so hard it had cost her life, one for the family that had been built instead of born. Maria read a letter. We found this in the safe deposit box, she said. It's addressed to you, Jonathan. He took it with hands that weren't steady and broke the seal. The paper was heavy, the ink a little smeared. He read silently first, because some things you hold alone for one moment before you let the world touch them. Then he read aloud. "Kid, though you're a man now, I never told you my name. I sat in the back of the room the night you argued when you were 16 that they should keep the lights on later at the center because homework matters. I watched you be brave when you thought nobody saw. I meant to introduce myself. Cowardice is quieter when it shows up dressed as humility. Forgive me. If I'm gone and they find you, please help them the way somebody once helped you. You owe me nothing. You owe the world everything you learn you can give. David." Jonathan didn't realize when he'd bent until Emily's hand found the back of his neck and anchored him a little. He stood and folded the letter like a prayer. After, in the small backyard of the house with the crooked shelf, Michael took 3 running steps and fell on his bottom, and then laughed. He stuck his arms up. "Daddy," he said, crisp now. Not just a syllable stumbled over, but a word with an address. Jonathan lifted him and did not pretend that tears meant weakness. He cried because he could. Emily wrapped her arms around both of them. The 3 of them fit into a triangle that felt stronger than a wall. They went to bed that night in rooms that belonged to them because belonging had been chosen and built and paid for with truth and fury and kindness. The house creaked in the way old houses do when the wind talks. No one flinched. The night was only a night. Epilogue. What you carry out of a fire, what people remember, is the moment at the steps, the red dress, the bear in a puddle, the way a gray suit looked too soft for a fight and then turned out to have steel stitched into every seam. They remember the gavel, the shouting, the parts where good triumphs because anything else sticks in the throat. But if you ask them years later, the people who were there, they'd tell you to remember other things too. Remember the neighbor whose own childhood porch had been a bed once and who stood up because silence would have felt like a second betrayal. Remember the guard who wrote down what he saw and trusted that paper could save lives. Remember the teacher who knocked, and the detective who didn't quit, and the judge who made the law feel like a blessing instead of a weapon. Remember the man who was a boy who had a letter in his pocket for 20 years, and a heart he had learned to put away the way you stash good plates in a cabinet because you don't think you deserve to use them on a Sunday. Remember the girl who asked the room a question no one could stand under without ducking and who discovered that bravery isn't louder than fear, it's just more stubborn. There are still people who say the media made the story bigger than it had to be. Maybe they're right. But in kitchens and courtrooms and community centers, smaller truths did their jobs. They found the cracks and planted something that bloomed where the cement had been poured too quickly. There is a photograph on the mantel of the house with the crooked shelf. 4 people in it, a man with a gray suit traded for jeans, a 7-year-old turned 8 turned 9, a toddler whose legs can outrun the old worries, and a woman with silver hair, Miss Rosa, who was there the day the little family decided to light candles. Behind them hangs a painting of a simple house with smoke curling up like a signature and 3 figures outside holding hands. Sometimes Emily stands in front of that painting and talks to her father. "We are okay," she says. "I miss you, but we are okay." And if you listen closely, to the way the house settles itself at night, to the way the wind moves the leaves in the tree outside, to the sound of a boy's laughter skipping across the floor, you can almost hear the reply. Good, good, carry each other. Where there is darkness, you become the light. In the end, evil didn't simply get punished in a courtroom. It starved in a house where kindness was fed every day. Truth didn't just win. It learned how to tuck a blanket around small knees, how to warm milk, how to build shelves and mismeasure and try again. Family wasn't found like a coin in the street. It was made, stitch by stitch, breath by breath, candle by candle, until it fit. And on every anniversary of a day that began with a bear in a puddle, they light 3 wicks, and the flames lean toward one another as if they know the way forward is always together.